Russian Minister of Defense just yesterday said that American private military contractors are preparing a provocation in Donbass that could involve chemical agents. Pentagon denied that, but I just wanted to ask you about the general picture, and do you find it plausible that private American military will end up being involved in Ukraine?
Well, this allegation, of course, is really surprisingly stupid and almost cartoonish for the Minister of Defense of a great country to say something like that without any sort of proof. But this is part of the messaging that, unfortunately, that's coming out of the Kremlin now to create a pretext for action, to talk about the threats against Russia. And I think this is more about preparing their own population for a situation so that they can say, we had no choice, we had to do this. I think that's what this is about, which is really unfortunate because it shows that they're not actually interested in any sort of real meaningful negotiation.
That's exactly what the Russian president just said. He said that Moscow and Russia in general has no space to retreat to at this point. Do you find that Russia is somehow cornered now?
Well, if they're cornered, it's because they put themselves in a corner. Remember, this whole conflict in Ukraine is a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, an illegal annexation of Crimea 7 years ago. And the continuous fighting in Donbass is only happening because Russia enables it, supplies it, leads it, participates in it, and prevents the OSCE special monitoring mission from doing its job. So any conflict in Ukraine is 100% the doing of the Kremlin, and they could stop it immediately if they wanted to. Now, I think you're right that they are in a little bit of a corner because they have escalated the language so much and deployed these thousands of troops in and around Ukraine. This is very expensive. And I think that at some point, the Kremlin will have to show something for all of this effort and this language to their own population to justify it. So I think that in a way, they have put themselves in a corner.
So, General, it all started with the speculations about possible and imminent invasion of Russia into Ukraine several weeks ago. But if we try to deconstruct the situation, what is the military, economic, political rationale for Russia to actually invade Ukraine? I gathered from your social media posts that you don't actually believe 100% in the possibility of such invasion.
Well, look, it's not inevitable. I mean, they have everything in place, or most everything is in place, but it's not inevitable that this is going to expand into further kinetic operations. And it is important for your listeners to keep in mind that there is already invasion. There is already kinetic operation that started in 2014. So what we're talking about is a possible expansion, further expansion of the kinetic operations that are already happening. But still, that doesn't mean it's inevitable. And obviously, I hope it's not. I think that the Kremlin is operating at a very high level of risk tolerance right now. I think that is partly because they feel confident. They have not been stopped since their invasion of Georgia. They've not really felt any serious pain in the Kremlin, the oligarchs around President Putin or himself. So I think as they look and see that the West, that we're still not fully unified, that we don't have the U.S. and Germany strongly shoulder to shoulder in terms of economic sanctions. So as long as it's like that, then I think the Kremlin feels that they have the upper hand. Mixed messaging coming from Washington, for example, this adds to the risk, I think.
So just so we understand, when it comes to mixed messaging, are you saying that there should not be any diplomatic kind of overtures towards Kremlin, because we know that there was an announcement about the beginning of strategic dialogue with Russia in January, both from Washington and Brussels. Do you think it's a wrong path to go down?
No, the opposite. I think it's essential that we continue to maintain a dialogue, but it's got to be a dialogue based on honesty, transparency, and from a position of strength. And we have to be consistent. I think if President Putin looks across the table and he sees just the American president, I think he believes, no, I can survive, I could weather American-only sanctions. But if he sees all of Europe and standing with the United States and Canada and the UK, that's a different story. But I mean, the United Nations has not been involved. OSCE gets brushed aside by the Kremlin. So I think that there are lots of opportunities for dialogue, but we know from history that the only effective dialogue is when you speak from a position of strength and are consistent. I think we made a mistake by unilaterally taken off the table without the Kremlin saying anything or offering anything when we said, use of military force is not an option or is not being considered. Yeah, maybe so, but why would you say that? And that's what I'm talking about. The delivery of additional Q-36 counterfire radar that were headed for Ukraine, that's been held up by the White House. Why is that? I mean, these are the kind of things that I consider mixed messaging, where it shows that we are prepared to give away things without even. And in the meanwhile, the Kremlin has only increased their demands. I'm also concerned that this would be U.S. Russia talking about Ukraine without Ukraine being involved, or without any of our allies, particularly in Eastern Europe, being involved. This is exactly what the Kremlin wants. They want to see U.S. and Russia as the two big guys figuring out spheres of who does what, as if this was the 18th century. And this is not the best approach in my view.
When it comes to the American strategy about Ukraine, as seen from Europe, you're in Germany now. What is this strategy? There have been infusions of military aid, financial aid. What is the final goal, and how do you see it from there?
Well, Yulia, that's the perfect question, because giving javelins to Ukraine or financial aid or these kinds of things, those are policy decisions. That's not a strategy. A strategy has to have clearly identified ends and then ways and means, with means being the resources, the ways being the policies for implementation. But the key that is missing is identifying the end. What is the end state that we want in the greater Black Sea region? And you can't really have a strategy for just Ukraine, in my view. I mean, Ukraine matters in a strategic sense because of where it sits on the map, on the Black Sea region, next to Russia, next to allies and partners. That's why it matters. And the Black Sea region matters because of economic potential, because we have 3 NATO allies there for which we are responsible for their collective security. The Black Sea is a bulwark against Iran, and it's also part of the great power competition economically for this east-west economic corridor between Europe and Eurasia. So for all these reasons, the Black Sea region matters, which means that Ukraine matters. And I think that the White House, and also for that matter, Berlin and Brussels, have not articulated why it matters. And therefore, they haven't been able to articulate what is the end state. For me, the end state is, number one, recognition and respect for the sovereignty of every nation there. We're talking about Georgia, not just Ukraine, but also Georgia, Moldova, and other countries. Number two, respect for and adherence to international law. Kremlin routinely violates international law, international agreements, and they suffer no pain for that. Thirdly, an end state, of course, would be the economic development of this Europe-Eurasia economic corridor that I'm talking about. So those are the end states that we want. Now, what are the policies that help us get there? And of course, that means the United States has got to invest a lot of effort, diplomatic effort, with our allies to improve the relationship with Turkey, for example, as well as improving our bilateral relationships with other countries in the region.
If we're talking about Russia's concerns, and we just heard that the leadership of Russia is asking for some guarantees from NATO for non-expansion and some security guarantees. And we know that Secretary Blinken already said that some of those are not acceptable, some of those may be discussed. How do you see this track, Russia-NATO, unfolding, developing in the future? And do you think that Russia has legitimate concerns about NATO's expansion, and how can those requests be accommodated, if at all, on the level of Washington and Brussels?
Yeah, so, well, first of all, I reject the premise that NATO's expansion is a threat to Russia. The safest part of Russia's boundaries or its border is the part that touches NATO. That's the one area where there's a guarantee that they're never going to be invaded. We have 150 American soldiers in Western Ukraine. That's it, 150. You could maybe fill up 2 school buses with that number of people. This is the massive threat that the Kremlin talks about. Russia's, of course, every nation is entitled to take steps for its own security. That's the duty of the government and each sovereign country. But the Kremlin is not entitled to this sphere where they get to make the choice for the foreign policy decisions of other sovereign nations. This is not the 18th century where Russia and Prussia and Austria divided up countries between themselves. Now, I think this list of the 9 demands that the Kremlin issued, none of them, 0, are acceptable. And the Kremlin knew that. They put this out, a list of completely impossible, unrealistic demands. They knew the West would not be able to, or would not be willing to accept. But then the Kremlin will say, look, we tried everything. It's our right to protect ourselves. We have no choice. This is all part of the ramping up and escalation of the language, which is extremely unhelpful. For sure, Europe and the United States needs to work with Russia. Russia, gigantic country, unlimited natural resources. It's critical when we talk about the Arctic. It's critical when we talk about China. It's critical when we talk about climate. All of these reasons are why the United States and Europe need to continue a dialogue with the Kremlin. But the Kremlin, I think, honestly, is not actually interested in that. And I think that the president of the Russian Federation right now is much more interested in his legacy and in this notion that of trying to restore the Russian Empire by bringing back Belarus, Ukraine, Georgia. I think that's what's driving what they're doing. And I think they see a window of opportunity where gas is such a powerful weapon for them. And the West looks weak and disjointed. I think that's what's driving this, unfortunately.